Please, I'd like to welcome Pastor Diaz to speak to us a bit on some various subjects.
All right. So I want to say, first of all, that this is a real honor for me. I'm not just saying that, I mean it. A few months ago, Brigitte Gabriel stood right here and presented to a large crowd of people her presentation, which was wonderful and very stirring. Now, I can't hope to come close to that, but the experiences that she has are just an incredible background dealing with Islam and dealing with the issues that Islam would present in a community such as where she came from, in Lebanon. But I'm going to share a little bit. Now, I'm no expert on Islam. Let me say that right off the bat. I don't understand the deeper things of Islam. I think I have a good understanding of Islam, a reasonable understanding of Islam. But what I do have is I do have experience dealing with a violent, aggressive Islam. Let me share my experience in that regard. About somewhere around 1984, actually exactly 1984, I immigrated here from a little island in the Caribbean called Trinidad. Ever heard of it? Ever heard of Trinidad? No? Of course, all right. So I came from the little island of Trinidad. Now, for 7 years on that island, between the ages of 12 and 19, roughly 7 years, I lived in a little community by the name of Aranguez, in case you're going to research me and fact check me. A little community by the name of Aranguez, and for 7 years I lived in that community. It was predominantly a Hindu community. It was about 99.9% East Indian, almost about that much. And it was a mixed community. You had about 80% Hindu and about roughly 15% Muslim. A very minute percentage mixed in there somewhere of people like myself. I grew up as a Presbyterian, but I lived in this community for these very important years of my life. So between the age of 12 and 19, those are very formative years. Right? Those are years that are going to sort of decide what the rest of your life is going to be like. Of course, you understand that. And so for 7 years, I lived in this community, Hindu, predominantly Hindu, 15% Muslim, but you know what I'm about to say. The 15% of the Muslims in the community absolutely dominated and governed the entire community. The Hindus, by and large, were subdued, quiet, passive, unless you really angered them, and then they would just explode. That's the way Hinduism is. But the 15% Muslims, or Islam in the community, they had complete control of everything. They controlled most of the businesses. They controlled the attitude, even the attitude of the community. And I grew up under that. And let me say, first of all, it was a very oppressive community. You can imagine just the spiritual side of it. 85% Hindu, that's spiritually oppressive enough, and you have 15% Muslim Islam. And I was subjected to that for 7 years. Now, in regards to the Muslims, the Hindus accepted me. I got along well with them. I lived really well with them. I befriended many of the children, the Hindu children in the community. I was one of these people that, as a non-Hindu, non-Muslim in that community, I was determined to experience the community, to live outside of the confines, the confines of my home. My brothers and my sisters, they chose to live within the confines of the home and not go out to experience the community. I decided that I was going to experience the community. And so I went out, and in some senses, I had to pay a price for doing that, right? Because here's this Christian kid who's not East Indian, living in a very East Indian community, who is Hindu and Muslim. So I paid the price for being out there, so to speak. So the Hindus, they accepted me quickly. The Muslims were much more careful. All right? Now, I did befriend many of the Muslim kids in the neighborhood, in the community, but their parents had a real problem with me. The parents of my Muslim friends, as I was growing up. They had a real problem with me because I was Muslim. And on several occasions, they made their displeasure with me known. In some cases, it was violent. I got kicked around, I got spat on, I got pushed into a ravine, denigrated completely a few times because I was Christian. I wasn't a Muslim. Now, not only did they kick me around and so on, they threatened me, threatened to kill me. My life was threatened by them. Fortunately, I managed to get out of all of those really difficult situations, and in some cases, you have to fight your way out, and that's just the way it was. So, my experience with Islam comes from that place. Like I said, 7 very important years of my life exposed to that type of oppression, very, very intense oppression. It makes it difficult for you to sleep at night. You understand? Because in that community, it's very uneasy. So also, one of the experiences that I also had in Trinidad is around 1978, 79, somewhere in that period, a black Muslim movement began to develop in Trinidad. Trinidad is about 45% African, and about the rest Indian and a mix of other races. So around 1978, 79, there was a black Muslim movement that began to form on the island, following after Elijah Muhammad. You've heard of Elijah Muhammad. And the name of the movement was Jamaat al-Muslimin. Jamaat al-Muslimin. And so they began to assert themselves very, very strongly around that time period. Now, I took note of them for sure, but they were not active in my community. Now, I moved out of that community, and I went to live in the capital of Port of Spain, of Trinidad, Port of Spain, and I began to come in contact with these African Muslims, the Jamaat al-Muslimin men, followers. One of the stark experiences I had with them was, now I'm older now, and I'm working in Port of Spain at that time, and every day I would pass through a certain plaza. Now I'm going to share this just to give you an idea of how aggressive Islam is. So I've told you already that I've experienced Islam on a very personal level. I've experienced the oppression and the fear that Islam brings. Now I want to share with you what I've observed now. Now I'm an adult. I'm 22 or 23 years old. I'm living away from the community. I'm beginning to experience African Islam for the first time outside of that community. So there's a plaza, as I worked in Port of Spain, Trinidad, that I would go through every day. And it's like any typical plaza in a main city. There were different peoples trying to raise funds. You had the Hare Krishnas. You remember the Hare Krishnas? They're not around anymore. They had the Hare Krishnas, and they would just assemble right at the front of the plaza, and they would try to raise funds, give you incense, talk to you about their movement, and they were fine. They were fine. They were peaceful people. Now I was going through this plaza one day, and I saw a collection of these Muslimin, the Jamaat al-Muslimin followers, and they were in the middle of the plaza, and they were doing their thing. They had little tables set up. They were handing out pamphlets and everything, and it was fine. Now I knew that something was going to happen. I knew it. I sensed that they were aggressive. Their aggression was going to lead them to doing something that they would typically do, something violent. So they stayed in the center of the plaza for a few weeks, but then the center of the plaza was not as lucrative as the mouth of the plaza, the head of the plaza. So within a very short space of time, they literally drove the Hare Krishnas off, the followers of Krishna, drove them off violently, beat them all around the streets of Port of Spain, chased them away, and took the front of the plaza. Now, I share that with you just to give you a sense for what Islam is. And these things I've seen with my own eyes. I remember standing there and saying, this right here, what I've just witnessed, after this thing happened, is really the essence of Islam. And this is, I mean, I'm talking about 1983 at this time. So for a very long time, I've been observing Islam and understanding the tactics of Islam, how Islam functions, how they would seed themselves and plan themselves to expand. And so I saw it. I experienced it firsthand. And it's oppressive. I want to tell you that. How many of us in this room tonight have experienced Islam on this level? And so, right. And you know it's a very oppressive thing. It it moves to drive fear and intimidation in you and move you to a place of complete surrender, which is what Islam is, right? This is how Islam will bring someone to a place of surrender or submission. Islam, that's the essence of Islam. So now let's talk about the tactics of Islam. Now I'm going to speak on Islam on a very broad level. All right, so I've shared my little experience with Islam. My battery is about to go. I'm down to 2%. My backup. So I'm going to share with you a little bit on a much broader level about Islam. We all know what taqiyya is. Who doesn't know what taqiyya is? Taqiyya is a spiritual allowance that gives the Muslim the freedom to lie, to deceive. And it's very real, and it's employed regularly in Islam. Now, originally, taqiyya was designed to help the Muslim who was in a precarious position, such as being persecuted, being held under duress. The Muslim at that point was allowed to lie, to deceive in order to get away from the precarious situation. That's initially what taqiyya is or was. Now, in the last 50 years or so, maybe even before 50 years, Islam has been employing taqiyya for the sake of jihad. You follow me? So originally, taqiyya was that a Muslim found himself in a bad place. You know, it's the Crusades or something like that, and the Christians have him, and they're persecuting him and so on, trying to convert him. He can lie. He's allowed to lie in Islam. Today, taqiyya is being employed for the furtherance of jihad. So I want to say, first of all, that I want to distinguish clearly between Islam and jihadi Islam. There is a difference. Islam, in and of itself, is not a bad religion, really. It's like many other religions. It has its tenets, its practices, and it has its own faith. It does. So Islam, in and of itself, by itself, it's fine. Apart from jihadi Islam, it's fine. Now, when you apply the reality of jihad to Islam, that's when Islam becomes a dragon. You follow me? That's when Islam becomes a beast that cannot be satisfied, period. Jihad is the problem with Islam. So where did jihad come from? What is the root of jihad? It's very simple. Muhammad, through conquest, established Islam. And it's the only way Islam could have been established. And I'm referring here to in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia initially. Islam, its birthplace was Mecca, or not really Mecca, but beyond Mecca, Medina, and other places in Saudi Arabia is in fact the birthplace, Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam. In order for Islam to expand beyond Saudi Arabia, it had to employ hegemony. It had to reach out and expand. And this is what Muhammad did. And so the philosophy of the tenet, the ideology of jihad is indelibly connected to Islam. Does that mean that every Muslim must employ Islam or must employ jihad? Does it mean that every Muslim must stand behind jihad? I don't think so. I think there is in fact a form of Islam out there, in fact I'm sure of it, that does not adhere to jihad. But by and large, in a broad sense, Islam is about jihad. The entire leadership of Islam, is committed to jihad. And you understand what jihad is. Jihad is taking over the world on behalf of Islam. So the entire leadership structure of Islam, in a very broad sense, is committed to jihad and cannot walk away from it. It is the one thing that holds commonality in the Islamic world. So, jihad tactics, it's what they have. It's their strength. In fact, jihad combined with taqiyya is the real strength of Islam. And when you add to that a unifying factor, so let's put those three factors together. A unifying factor, the taqiyya factor, and the reality of jihad, you have a very, very explosive world religion. And it is It is. I've been seeing this for many years. We once had a very eloquent and very well-known speaker from Israel come to this congregation. I'm not going to name him, but he was very well known. He headed up many think tanks in Israel. And he came here and he spoke on Islam. And then in his talk, he was very optimistic that Islam would be subdued by means that he mentioned. And I listened to the means that he mentioned, and it just wasn't aggressive enough. He talked about almost placating with Islam. Sitting with them at the table and arriving at some commonalities with them, and maybe then we can come to a place of understanding and cooperation. And I totally disagreed with him. I didn't do it publicly, but following the meeting, I sat with him, and I shared with him, I said, I don't agree with you. And I respect the fact of who you are. Tremendous person, but my experience with Islam is that there is no satisfying Islam, and the reason that there's no satisfying Islam is because of the three factors that we just mentioned. Islam is strong, very strong world movement, isn't it? I don't have to say that, you know it. And it's strong because of taqiyya, those three factors that I mentioned, taqiyya and jihad, and the unity that they can have in that regard. Now, unity, let's talk about unity. The unity is a very powerful factor in and of itself, a unifying force. In fact, this country right now is very ununified, and from a certain standpoint, we're not a very strong country. And we're not a strong country because we're so divided. And I don't have to go into that, you know it very well. Politically, we're very divided. In terms of our faith, our religious movements that once made up the backbone of this great country, we're so far apart. And so we're not a strong country because we're a divided country. And so perhaps, and the hope is that perhaps, at some point in the future, we can come back to it and understand, as they said in Trinidad, as a child growing up, united we stand, divided we fall. And right now, as a country, we are certainly declining and seems like we may fall. Not necessarily so, but we certainly seem to be in that posture of taking a fall because we're not united. Not so with the Islamic world. The Islamic world is very united. You say, wait a minute, they're not. They have so many sects, so many divisions, and you're absolutely right. What are the two main sects or the two main divisions of Islam? The Sunni and the Shiite. All right. So we understand that there are many sects, and those are not the only sects, right? There are many sects and subsects of Islam. But I want to tell you this. In regards to jihad, they're all united. They may have differences on many levels in regards to not so significant things, but when it comes to jihad, they are extremely united. And I had a debate one time with a Muslim, and this guy was a lawyer. He was involved with CAIR, and he was a bright guy. I mean, he was a bright guy. He was much smarter than myself, much sharper than me. I didn't have much going for me, but I took him on. In fact, I was put in a position where I had to take him on, and he went on and on back and forth, and finally he cried the discrimination. He pulled the discrimination card, that I'm being discriminatory against Muslims, and I dealt with that a little bit. But then I said to him, he made a point that I'm a Sunni Muslim. I'm not a Shiite Muslim. I'm not like the Shiites who are terrorist-oriented, and the Shiites. So he was sort of passing the buck on to the Shiites, trying to make the point under the auspices of taqiyya, because I knew he was lying. He was trying to make the point that I'm a Sunni Muslim and I'm not like those Shiites who will blow up your buildings. So finally I got a bit of wisdom and I said to him, okay, here's a scenario. Shiite Islam becomes really strong in this country, and by the way, they are becoming strong in this country. I said, so here's a scenario. This is 20 years ago. I debated this Muslim. I said, Shiite Islam becomes a strong force in this country. They become politically integrated into the fabric of the country, and they ultimately take New York City. A coup d'etat in a localized area, New York. Let's say that happens. And they take New York City, but you're against them. You're not standing with them because they're Shiites. But they take New York City and they begin to implement Sharia law and they begin to exercise their jihad. Would you not stand with them? When I asked him that question, he immediately said, you're trying to trap me. Because it was on the phone and the call was being recorded. He said, no, you're trying to trap me. I said, no, I'm not trying to trap you. I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from. And I also want to let you know that you're being deceptive. Because you would stand with your Shiite brothers should something like that ever happen. So you do have something in common with the Shiites. You are a jihadi. And the conversation came to an end. All right, and so that scenario that I just played for you is very real. 20 years ago I said it, but as we speak right now, jihadi Islam, Shiites and Sunnis are preparing to somehow in this country implement Sharia law, aren't they? Are they not doing this? Absolutely. The scenario with New York City that I just laid out for you, isn't that happening somewhere in the world right now? That they're capturing an entire city. It's happening in London. It's happening right now in London as we speak. Jihadi Islam, Shiite or Sunni, is now succeeding upon capturing jolly old London. Did you ever think that you would see that in your lifetime? I didn't. Not jolly old London. Impossible, but they are. And how are they doing it? They're succeeding by their unity, not only by their unity, but they have a tendency to ally with forces that will work against the society that they're a part of. They're experts. They're experts at this. For instance, you've heard before, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You've heard that before. This is a very real factor in Islam. Islam, from my observation now, would move into a community. They would do their best to integrate, although they will never fully integrate, right? They can never fully integrate, because in order for them to fully integrate, it would mean that they would have to deny the reality of who they are. So they will never fully integrate, but their integration would be tepid. But on the surface, it would look like integration, at least initially. After a time, that integration will evaporate, and they will exactly show their colors. That's the mode of Islam. And that's what we're seeing in Europe. It's happening right now, not only in Dearborn, Michigan as well. I must tell you, Orlando is a prime target for Islam. Orlando is on their list. We don't want to get into that, right? We want to stay away from that as much as we can. But you see, Islam is prevailing upon not only jolly old London, but many parts of Europe as well. There is one of those countries, Scandinavia, one of those countries over there right now, and I don't remember exactly which country, where they are literally protesting and going after making the entire country a Muslim country. What country is it? Sweden, one of those countries, which is very typical of Islam, very typical of Islam. I want to tell you a little story about this movement, Jamaat al-Muslimin, this Muslim movement in Trinidad. In 1990, there was a coup d'etat in Trinidad. You probably didn't know this. Little island in the Caribbean, the first of the archipelago of islands, right next to Venezuela. There was a coup d'etat that succeeded for about 2 weeks. A certain Muslim by the name of Abu Bakr, who was leading up that Muslim organization, Jamaat al-Muslimin, his name was Abu Bakr. He succeeded to capture that country, that little country, for 2 weeks and brought it this close to complete and total subjugation. Outside in the country's docks, in the wharf of the country, out in the docks of the country, there were 2 40-foot containers sent from Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, packed with munitions and weapons. And those 2 containers were to be docked at a certain point in that period of his coup d'etat. And in fact, they did dock the 2 containers, but they didn't They didn't open them or they hadn't received them yet, but they were sitting in the dock. The idea was to get these containers of munitions and arms in, initiate a coup d'etat, and take those weapons and capture the island. Islam, jihadi Islam, had a plan for this little island in the Caribbean, and that plan was to make it the very first Muslim country in the Western Hemisphere. This little island in the Caribbean was destined to become the first Muslim country in the Western Hemisphere. How did it fail? Well, of course, the United States threatened to get involved. That was a big move, but this Abu Bakr, he had many people hostage, and he was completely locked down. The local regiment, the local army was attempting to do something about him, but they weren't succeeding. A friend of mine, a guy by the name of Panton, last name Panton, Tony Panton, he had a jamming device, a signal jamming device. And Abu Bakr will get on to the airwaves, television, every night, and he would mesmerize the Trinidadian people, speak to them about the hope of a Muslim state and how wonderful it would be. And my people on the island told me he was convincing. He was beginning to win people over in that 2-week period of coming on because one of the first things he did when he seized the country, he took the Capitol building. It's called the Red House. Don't ask me why. But he took the Red House, he took many government officials hostage, and then he took the only TV channel on the island. Of course, you know why. And he begins transmitting every night for hours, just mind controlling the people, using all sorts of mind control tactics. And according to what I heard, like I said just now, he, Abu Bakr, was prevailing upon the people. And so if he had the support of the people, he would have had the island. And this friend of mine, Tony Panton, had the only signal jamming device. And he finally got it to work, and he jammed the signal. For days, they couldn't get it up. And that was what turned the country around, because the people began to say, wait a minute, we don't want this. You know, the United States are about to crack down on us. They're about to bear down on our little island. We don't want it. Get out of there. And the people stood up and said no, and eventually Abu Bakr was pushed out. But you see how close this little country in the Caribbean came to becoming a Muslim state. Now think about that. We would have had a Muslim state in the Western Hemisphere. This is in 1990. So you say that it's all done. There's no longer a threat. Not true at all. Not true at all. This little island, Trinidad, has sent more fighters to ISIS than any other country in the world per capita. You follow me? Even more per capita than some of the Muslim countries of the Middle East. Trinidad did that. This little island that I came from sent more ISIS fighters to the battlefield than most of the Muslim countries. How is that possible? Because there's a very strong root of jihadi Islam on that little island. Keep your eyes on it. Keep your eyes on it. One day you're going to wake up and there's going to be another coup d'etat, and hopefully they won't be successful. But the plans that they had, or they have, for this little island in the Caribbean is sort of a microcosm of what they have of the plans they have for all humanity. The biggest or the largest stumbling block that Islam faces is you. This country, you. And you know, the country is the people, right? Not necessarily the geographic location. The country is the people. So the greatest impediment to Islam is you and me. We represent the only thing that can stop Islam. This country is their largest foe, their greatest foe. That's who we are. That's why we're the great Satan. Israel, the little Satan. And so let's talk about that for a while. Unity is their strength. Like I said, that's their strongest factor. Unity and jihad, and the factor of taqiyya. How are they using that in this country right now as we speak? Can we recognize how it's being employed in this country right now? Look at what's happening in the government. My goodness, we have people in the Congress that are clearly jihadists, obviously jihadists, and they're using women. Nice tactic. Very nice tactic. We know how much Islam respects women. And so here are these women being presented as leaders in the Islamic world. They know exactly what they're doing. And they're proceeding well in that regard, aren't they? How else is Islam encroaching upon this country right now as we speak? How else? Anyone? Politically, they're there. What about in our scholastic centers? Right? Our scholastic centers are being encroached upon heavily. How about in our communities? Do we see a change in our communities? Well, that's exactly, those 3 steps are exactly the 3 steps that Islam will take in order to infiltrate. You've heard the whole Trojan horse analogy. I don't have to repeat it for you. It's very real. And so here is their Trojan horse. Political infiltration, scholastic infiltration, if I can refer to it that way, and just being a part of the community, being accepted in the community. You see, Islam, again, is like I said, they will come into a community and they will only partially adapt. They can never fully adapt and transform. They will only do it partially in order to get your acceptance. And once they feel like they have your acceptance, that's when they begin to manifest. Now, what are we seeing in the world today relative to Islam? I'm speaking now globally, not just here in this country, or in this community, or in Detroit. What are we beginning to see? We're beginning to see something a little different in the Islamic world. What are we seeing? A bold manifestation of who they really are. In effect, they're coming out. They're beginning to present their true colors, in other words. Indonesia, what's happening in Indonesia today? Anyone knows? Islam is beginning to ravage Indonesia. Indonesia. Now, that's a little complicated, but it's happening there. What's happening on the continent of Africa? Islam has been active in Africa for a very long time, right? For 1,200 years. Very active. In the last 20, 30 years, they've become incredibly more active and much more aggressive. You know, it used to really baffle me that 25 years ago, we heard about all of these civil unrest matters, where whole communities were being decimated by other communities, and the media would say, civil unrest. But it wasn't civil unrest. It was Islam moving in and taking over communities, Christian communities. So all of this civil unrest that we read about and heard about from CNN and all of the other wonderful news outlets that talked about civil unrest, complete lies. And so that brings me to another question. Why is the leftists in this country placating to Islam at the rate that they are? What's happening? That they would even go to the extent of deceiving on behalf of Islam. How did that happen? When did this unholy marriage occur? Where the leftists in this country are actually doing the work to advocate Islam. How did that happen? Right. And so the leftists in this country, they despise anything conservative. They despise anything Christian or Judaic, and anything Judeo-Christian. They despise anything that has a foundation of biblical truth. There's just a natural hatred towards it. And so here comes Islam, and Islam is aggressive and they know it. And so they can side with Islam because the enemy of my enemy is in fact my friend. But how long will that last? Or will it last? Do you suppose that unholy marriage would last? No, it will not. It reminds me, I once thought of an analogy to compare it to. The medieval stories about dragons and damsels in distress, right? All of the myths that we used to read about and hear about. A community, a walled city is being threatened by a dragon in a cave. And in order to appease the dragon, they would take one of the maidens, a damsel in distress, and they would plant her out there, tie her to a stake, and this will appease the dragon, right? The dragon will come, take the damsel in distress and go back to the cave, and everything will be good for 2 more years. And then 2 years, they'll do it again. It's how you appease the dragon, right? And so I think the leftists in this country, that this leftist institution that we're so aware of, they are like that walled city, all right? They're like that walled city. And there's a dragon, and the truth is they're petrified of this dragon, but they want to befriend the dragon because they believe that if they befriend the dragon, there's another walled city over there that the dragon might turn against. And that other walled city are people like you and me. So these leftists in this walled city, they decide, well, we'll just offer this dragon a little sacrifice from time to time, a damsel in distress. What is the damsel in distress? The fabric of our society, the very fabric of who we are. They will offer it up before this dragon of Islam with the hopes of appeasing it. And they would say, okay, so the dragon takes a little bit of the fabric of our society. It's not too bad, just a little bit. Some time goes by, we have to offer a little more. But before long, what is the dragon going to do? Well, he's going to hop right over that wall, isn't he? Because he's a dragon, he's a beast. He doesn't understand containment. And that's exactly what, to me, it appears to be in this country. There's a damsel in distress, and that damsel is the very fabric of American lifestyle. There's a walled city, and that walled city is the incredibly powerful leftist movement in this country. And that dragon in that cave is Islam. But what is happening as we speak right now? The dragon is leaping at this walled city. The dragon has had enough of the damsel in distress. And the dragon is saying, I'm going to go for the full Monty, every bit of it. Yes, in the first walled city, the walled city of liberalism, leftism, they will throw whatever they have out, whatever they can offer up, be it the gay, lesbian agenda, or whatever. And they will put it out there for the dragon to be appeased with. Eventually, like I said, the dragon is going to have enough of that appeasement, and they're going to go for the full Monty. The dragon is really concerned about the second walled city. I hope I'm not confusing you with my analogy. I hope I'm not. The dragon is really interested with the conservative movement in this country because the dragon of Islam fears us the most. They have more respect for us, much less respect for the liberal establishment, for the leftists. They see them as an easy conqueror. Unfortunately, that is absolutely the truth. Again, let me say this without any ambiguity. If Islam can be separated from jihadi Islam, we would have a wonderful religion. A religion that we can coexist with. But the problem is jihad. It is a religion that's driven to conquer. Now, I grew up with Muslims. And I today interact with Muslims as well who are not jihadi minded. And they're workable. You can work with them, you can interact with them. It's not bad. You can function alongside them. Once they embrace that jihadi ideology, it's useless. Because they are driven to conquer. They must conquer. It's that dragon, right? The dragon must be fed. So globally, what are we seeing? Africa, the entire continent of Africa, it's on the brink of complete decimation. Not that I'm using hyperbole, but you understand my point. Entire Christian communities have been taken over, destroyed, forcibly converted. And it's happening all the time. Not only Africa, Europe. Look at Europe, France. The Parisians are no longer Parisians. Paris is no longer Paris. Paris of 20 years ago does not exist anymore. Am I wrong? No. It's an entirely different world. Many places in Europe are being taken over this way. And of course, like I said, the dragon has its eyes set on me and you. From their standpoint, they have the liberal establishment. It belongs to them. It's me and you that impedes them. Islam is very close almost controlling the liberal institutions of this country. Look at the House of Representatives. You have 3 Islamic women in there, and they are so powerful. How many Baptists do we have in the House of Representatives? Honestly, how many Baptists do we have in the House of Representatives? We probably have a few, many, but they're unheard of. How many Hindus do you suppose exist in the House of Representatives? I'm sure there is a few. Are they featured? Are they on that spotlight? No, they're not. But these, how many? 2 Muslim women, or 3 Muslim women, they are constantly in the forefront. Who's putting them in the forefront? The liberal establishment, the media. And Hollywood is very much connected with it as well. Now, yes?
You differentiated between the jihadi Islam and regular Islam. But regular Islam also believes in Sharia law, doesn't it? Isn't that dangerous?
So the Muslims that I interact with frequently and have in the past, they're not so keen about Sharia. They would just tell you straightforwardly that Sharia law would bring a complete change of lifestyle. And really, we don't want it. But there is this higher level commitment that they're committed to that comes from the vast leadership portion of Islam that says a good Muslim must support jihad. And many Muslims who are so-called moderate, they would ultimately cave under that pressure, I think. I would like to think, and I'm not sure if this is possible or feasible or not, I would like to think that sometime in the future there would be a Muslim movement that would stand up and say no to the vast span of Muslim leadership and say, no, we're not going to accept your form of Islam. I'm not real optimistic about it. But what's wrong with being hopeful? Right? What's wrong with being hopeful? I'm hopeful, but I'm not entirely optimistic. Again, I felt the raw intimidation of Islam. I was beaten, I was spat upon, I was kicked around, pushed around. The fear of Islam was driven into me, and I must say that with some pleasure, I am no longer intimidated by Islam. So let me finish my little presentation, and I'll take on as many questions and comments as you want. So, we're seeing effectively the coming out of Islam, a bold manifestation of Islam around the world. Europe, Africa, even in South America. Don't think for a moment, okay folks, don't think for a moment that what's happening in Venezuela isn't connected to Islam, because it is. The Iranians have been involved in Islam for a long time. In Venezuela for a long time. They've been directly involved, and I've known about this for at least 10 years. Hezbollah is active in Venezuela, has been active in Venezuela for about 20 years. I have good contacts in Trinidad who does business or did business in Venezuela, and they told me 10 years ago that Hezbollah, the Iranian organization of Hezbollah, is very active in Venezuela and in Colombia. So even here in South America, we have the encroachment of jihadi Islam. They're all over the world. They're spreading. China, I love China. China is saying no to Islam. and China is willing to utilize force in order to keep Islam out of their borders. This is the only thing that Islam truly respects. Force. Much superior force. So let's talk about Israel. We as a congregation here at Fellowship, we do a lot in Israel and with Israel. Now, I've witnessed Islam in Trinidad. I've shared that with you. And then I've witnessed Islam firsthand in Israel. And let me say this, it's entirely different in Israel. In Israel, it is more openly hateful than what I experienced in Trinidad or in this community. The Islam that I am exposed to in this community is still at its preliminary stage. In other words, it isn't quite advanced as yet. It will eventually get to a place of open manifestation, coming out, so to speak. It will eventually, that's inevitable. But what I experienced in Israel is different.
The Islam that I experience in Israel is malignant. It's hateful. It loads Israelis, Jews, with a deep, deep hatred. Now, in regards to historic Islam, right, historic Islam, in fact, was at one point in time, for a very long time, very amiable with Jewish people, with Israel. Very amiable with Israel. Got along well, for instance, in Spain and Portugal. The age of Andalusia, where in Spain and Portugal they had this symbiotic relationship. The Moors and the Jews of Spain and Portugal got along very well. Famously, they worked together, as a matter of fact. Now, what has happened since Andalusia that has brought the Muslim world to a point of such hatred against the Jewish people? What has happened? Anyone? Not a rhetorical question. I'll frame the question again. What has happened in the last maybe 100 years that has caused Islam to turn against the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, with such hatred? The reality of the restoration of Israel is what has excited the Islamic world. Now, this recognition of Israel being restored to the land of Israel really goes back to the late 1800s, right? The modern Zionist movement. At that time, the Islamic world became very concerned. Now, to that point, since the defeats of the Crusades, we're talking now the 1300s, the 1200s, from that point to the mid-1800s, Islam was relatively subdued. The Ottoman Empire had control, had the caliphate of the Islamic world, and they were not particularly aggressive. They were aggressive, but not expansive. They were not trying to expand their caliphate. But something happened. Right around the end of the Ottoman Empire, the First World War, the land of Israel began to be filled. Jews from around the world began to come to the land of Israel. And this was a signal to the Islamic world, and the signal was, we can't let this happen. This looks like the redemption of Israel that their Bible talks about. Listen, the Muslims, historically the Muslims, has had great respect for the Jewish people. They were the people of the book. What book? The Tanakh. The Tanakh, the Torah and the Tanakh. And so the Muslim world, they had great respect for these people. They were the people of the book. You may not know this, but initially, Islam had respect for Christianity as well. Not the Christianity of the 4th century onwards. Not conventional Christianity. Not Catholicism, so to speak. But they had great respect for a Christian movement that existed in their midst. And they referred to that movement as Al-Nasra. The Al-Nasra. We were known as the Al-Nasra. And they had great respect, and they got along with us very well. The problem that they saw with Christianity is what took place in Nicaea, conventional Christianity. They hated conventional Christianity, and they became an enemy to conventional Christianity. A lot of it had to do, of course, with the Crusades. All right? Crusades had a lot to do with it. But historically, Islam, had great respect for the people of the book and for what I would call the biblical Christians. All of that began to change rapidly once they realized that the time of the restoration of Israel had come, mid-late 1800s, early 1900s. That was their signal that the time had come for them to arise and fight. And that's what they've been doing ever since. So much of the jihad push, I want to say this, much of the push of jihad that we see in the world today has to do with the state of Israel. Jihadi Islam would not have much of a problem with us, the United States of America, had it not been for Israel. Do you follow me? First of all, I believe, had it not been for the restoration of Israel, Jihadi Islam would have been relatively quiet today. It is because of Israel. And what's behind that? Well, there's something incredibly spiritual and demonic behind it. Islam exists as an impediment to the kingdom of God. Now, this is where the pastor in me is going to come up. The preacher in me is going to come up. Israel represents the hope of God's kingdom being established on the earth. That's what Israel represents. The spirit behind Islam understands that and will do everything in its power to prevent it from happening. This is at the essence of the conflict of jihad that's covering this planet right now. You follow me? I don't want to go too far afield in this regard, but it's very spiritual and has so much to do with what's written in the prophets, the restoration of the people of Israel, the land of Israel. And that's what this conflict is really all about. So what can we do? What can we do? This is where I'm supposed to bring this to a close. I'm following my close out, entertain questions, even comments. What can we do? Now, I'm referring to us here as we being conservative, right-minded Americans. I'm not saying we as Christians or as Jews or as even atheists or agnostics. What can we do in response to what we see with Islam? Well, let me say this. Whoever we are, if we're Christian, nominal Christian, fervent Christian, Pentecostal, whatever we are, we have to be more of who we are. You follow what I'm saying? This time in our history is a time for us to sort of gird up. You know that old biblical phrase, to gird up? What does that mean? To tighten your belt, to get strong, to strengthen yourself. And that's what the belt represents, to gird up, to strengthen yourself. So what I'm saying is it's time for us to gird up. It's time for us to be more of who we are, to strengthen ourselves against the advancement of Islam. Now, I'm not in any way at all inferring that we physically resist Islam. There are many ways to resist Islam without having to even consider force. Be more of who you are. Now, if you're a Christian, and I know some of you are Christians, I want to encourage you in this regard. The Bible teaches that it is love that breaks the yoke of bondage. That's what the Bible teaches. And I want to echo that right now and tell you that it is love that will break the yoke of Islam. I've seen it with my own eyes. I know it's real. I'm not just saying this because it sounds good. It makes for a good conclusion. No, I'm not saying it for that reason. I'm saying it because I've seen it with my own eyes. It's real. And what love am I referring to? Love of God. When a Muslim can witness the love of God working through a human being, be it Jewish or Christian, it reaches out to them. It touches them. I've seen it in my own eyes. I want to share with you an experience in that regard. On the Jordan River, about 8 years ago, I'm not sure exactly what year it was. I go to Israel every year, and I baptize people just about every year on the Jordan River. One year, we arrived on the Jordan River, and the site that I do the baptisms at is exactly where Israel crossed over from the wilderness into the land of Israel. It's called Gilgal. And that particular site is also where John the Baptist baptized. And that's exactly where Jesus would have been baptized. A wonderful site. If you ever plan to go to Israel, come see me and I will tell you how to get there. So we were having a baptism. I had about 15 people to baptize that particular year. And we were at the Jordan, right there at the side of the river. And we were baptizing. And our baptisms are very, how should I say it, very organic, very little liturgy. Very little liturgy. We try to keep it real, if I can use that phrase. And I will encourage people to testify. We'll sing a few songs. We'll read a few Bible references and I will baptize. Very simple, but from my point of view, very rich. Especially when you consider the location, right? The Jordan River. And so I'm there and I'm baptizing people. And it was really crowded. It was really, really crowded. We had a group of Russians who didn't know what underwear was. We had a group of Russians who had these white gowns on, and they were void of the fact that they should wear underwear. That wasn't very nice. It made for a difficult time, but we overcame the Russians. But it was very crowded, and suddenly 2 busloads of Muslim schoolgirls pulled up. They came down. Just about 50 or 60 Muslim teenagers, all between the age of 13, 14 to 18 perhaps. And they came down the stairs to where we were. They stood right in front of us. And I remember standing there and I'm saying, okay, what's going on here? They're Muslims, and they're poor Muslims because they have all of the garb and everything, and they're chaperones with them, female chaperones. And I'm saying, this is not comfortable, because right behind me, about 15 feet away, are the Jordanian Waqf, the Jordanian authorities, because the other side of the Jordan is Jordan. And so they have submachine guns in their hands, and in front of me are 50 or 60 young Muslims. And they're standing there staring at me with a strange look on their faces. And I'm there, and I'm not stopping, I'm carrying on the baptisms. And one woman came in and she began to share about why she was being baptized, and she wept. And as she testified as to her baptism, she wept. And we sang a song. And as we were doing this, I just looked up at these Muslim teenagers, and many of them were weeping. Many of them stood there weeping, with a bewildered look on their face. Let me say this, the door was wide open. They were witnessing, perhaps for the first time, the love of God on a level that they've never come close to. They witnessed it, and it reached out to them, grabbed a hold of them. And I saw it. I even sensed, and my senses are strong at those moments, I even sensed that a couple of them wanted to come forward. That would have been noisy. That would have been noisy for sure. But I sensed that they wanted to come forward, and I stood there and I said, you know what? If they do come forward, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to pull back from it. Wouldn't even entertain such a thing. But they didn't. But they had that look on their face, like, what is this? This is real. I don't get it, but I want it. They had that look on their face. Again, they were experiencing the love of God, the reality of God's love being shared in one human being. They saw it, and it opened them up. Finally, one of the chaperones came over to us and said to one of the women in my hearing, she said to the woman, you guys are real Christians. And the person that she said that to, the lady that she said that to, chuckled, didn't know how to respond to it, chuckled, and the woman said, no, I'm serious. You guys are real Christians. And she quickly scurried these children, these teenagers, and rushed them back to the bus. So, we almost had a situation where I may have been in a position to baptize a few Muslim girls. What would have happened if 2 or 3 of them had stepped forward and said to their chaperones, I want to be baptized, with the Jordanian guards behind me? What do you think would have happened? Any number could have played at that time, but it didn't. They were taken off. But you see, I want to tell you this. That morning at the Jordan River, with these 50 or 60 young Muslim girls, seeds were planted. What types of seeds? Seeds of the true love of God, because it's something that's void in their religious order. It's not there. If it's there, it's very scarce. They don't get enough of it. But we have it. If you're a Christian, I'm speaking to you. You have it. Let the love of God so permeate in you that if you get around a Muslim or a Hindu or anyone for that matter, a Baptist, it will emanate from you. And you will reach them. If you're a Christian. If you're not a Christian, whatever you are, just be more of who you are. Be determined to stand. Because this country is in the process of being taken over. It's in the process of being taken over. Had the former administration gained its continuance to this point, in other words, if Hillary Clinton had won the elections, we would have been looking at a completely different country. Because there was a plan in place that had already began to be actuated. There was a plan in place already being actuated to bring many more refugees from Syria and Iraq into this country. The plan was to flood this country, just as it happened in Europe, with these quote-unquote refugees, which we know that they were not. Europe is beginning to figure that out right now. The Parisians are beginning to understand that. that they were not refugees, they were activists, they were insurgents. So I praise God that, first of all, Hillary was not elected. I praise God for Trump. I pray for him, and we must pray for him, because I don't think there's another human being on the planet that's placed in such an incredible crucible. Think of that position. I wouldn't want 5 minutes of his job, but that's where he is. And I think the Holy One has strengthened him and has positioned him for where he is. But I think there is an answer to the problem of jihadi Islam, and the answer lies within us. We are the people in that second walled city. And that dragon is really afraid of us. Really afraid of us. Intimidated by us. Because we have the ability to stop him. We have the ability to stop him. Yes?
Speaking of threatening, when Brigitte Gabriel spoke here 2 months ago, you received a letter from the Council on American Islamic Relations that tried to intimidate you to cancel the talk.
Yes.
What's your feelings on that, and how did they intimidate you, or try to?
I didn't receive the letter before I was told about it. So I was told about it, that this email was sent to the church, and they're trying to get you to not have the meeting with Brigitte. And I knew what it was. I wasn't surprised by it at all. I'm someone who's been really subjugated by Islam, and I understand how it works. It's very intimidating. So the wording of the letter, if you look at it on the surface, you might pick up some hints of intimidation. But if you read between the lines of the email, it was extremely intimidating. The heading of the letter mentioned my wife. You know, peace and blessings to you and your wife. Why did you have to mention my wife? So there was a very strong intimidating factor in there. And I initially put together a little thought to respond. And a friend of mine is a lawyer, and I saw him, and he said, nice but not so nice. And he drafted up a response, and we sent out a response to them, basically saying, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. More or less. Yeah, I wasn't about to bring a close to that meeting because they were upset with us. What really kind of fascinated me about it is, my name is Diaz. So the initial assumption, looking like I do, and with the name that I have, is that you're Puerto Rican, Cuban, or something. Not until I speak with this outrageous accent do they realize that, well, he's not Spanish. But this person that wrote this letter, he was a Hispanic, and I can't remember his name right now, but he had a Spanish name, and he was representing the Muslim Spanish community here in this area throughout Florida. So let me share with you what I saw immediately. They saw my name, assumed that I was Spanish, so they put me onto the Spanish department of CAIR. And the idea was this Spanish person from Puerto Rico would somehow resonate in me because he's Spanish, I'm Spanish, I'm going to fear him, I'm going to respect him. Of course, it didn't succeed with me because, first of all, I'm from an English-speaking country, and there was no need for them to put a Spanish person onto me. So I saw it as really a pitiful attempt to stop me from going forward with our plan. There was no way it was going to succeed. Absolutely no way. Yes?
Didn't 9/11 teach us something about the radical Muslims? I guess we're forgetting what happened, didn't we?
All right. So the people that carried out the 9/11 attack, they were certainly jihadi. They certainly represented the leadership of Islam. They were appointed by what I would refer to as the leadership of the Islamic world. They were commissioned for that purpose. They are not the people that I'm referring to. The people that I'm referring to are almost people like me and you. They live in a community, they're trying to get by, they have businesses, they work, they live and they want to live. But then there's this heavy, top-heavy entity that bears down on them, and they have no choice but to go along with it. Now, I'm not saying that those people are the majority of Islam. I'm not saying that at all. Community and culture has a lot to do with it. But I think it's not fruitful for us to stigmatize all Muslims. It's not fruitful because ultimately we want to do what? We want to affect their lives, right? Isn't that true? We want our opportunity to let the love of God shine through us. Well, we're not going to do a very good job at that if we're stereotyping all Muslims. You see, and the truth is, not all Muslims are in that place. Yes, the vast majority of the leadership are extremely aggressive and jihadi. Absolutely. Anyone else? You had a question or a comment?
You mentioned the Crusades, and my husband has a business friend who's a Muslim, and it was during the terrorist attacks. And he goes, well, you Christians, you did the Crusades. And I did a little bit of research. It really wasn't quite like that.
That's right.
So would you
Yeah.
clarify that?
All right. Fortunately, I have a little bit of a good take on history as it relates to the land of Israel, Jerusalem, the Jewish nation, Islam, and Christianity. I do have a bit of a degree of background in that. So, after 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and the vast majority of the Jewish population of Jerusalem, the land of Israel, were driven out. Within 100 or so years, they began to filter back in, small pockets. And then came the Bar Kokhba revolt, and Bar Kokhba was a messianic figure that stood up against the Romans and did very well in pushing back on the Romans. Finally, Hadrian, on behalf of the Roman Empire, came down with legions of Roman soldiers and destroyed the Bar Kokhba revolt and pushed even more of the Jews out of the land of Israel. That's when he named the land of Israel Palestine. All right. Now, following that, the land of Israel was under the control of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Church, right? The Byzantine, or the Western Roman Empire religion, was simply representing what Hadrian had done in the land of Israel. Now, so the Byzantine were there for many, many centuries, up until the 8th century or so, when Islam began to encroach upon Jerusalem. Okay, so the Byzantine, or the Christians, were there. They were Romans, right? Remember that Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans, and it remained that way until about the 8th century, when Islam, after the death of Muhammad, Islam decided that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there wasn't a mosque there, but that the Temple Mount was an important site for Islam. The idea that Muhammad ascended into heaven from that spot became popular in the Muslim world, and so Jerusalem became a point of contention on behalf of Islam. And after some back and forth, some jostle, some battle, some war, the Muslims took Jerusalem somewhere in the 9th, 10th century, and this was a huge insult to the Christian world. A huge affront.
Damascus was the first Christian city the Muslims took. Jerusalem the second, Alexandria the third. They were all taken before the year 800.
Before it, all right. So Jerusalem became a real strong point of contention. Islam saw it necessary to capture Jerusalem, to build a mosque on the most holy spot in Judaism, and sort of seal it for themselves. All right. So somewhere in the 9th century, 800s or so, this happened. And then the response from the Christian world, from the Vatican, because the Byzantine Empire became less important, and the Roman Church began to grow at that time, the Western Church. Now, the response from the Western Church is that we must do something to retake Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem is an important city. We're leading up now to the end of the first millennium. The Christians of that time, the Roman Catholics, the Western Christians at that time, believed that at the end of the millennium, Jesus was going to return, and that they had to take Jerusalem for that to happen. This was a theology. And they marched against Jerusalem, against the Muslims, and there were battles back and forth, The Christians would take it, keep it. The Muslims would come, defeat them. Tremendous battles. And ultimately, somewhere in the 11th, 12th century, and you seem to know the history, a clan by the name of the Mamluks, a Muslim clan by the name of the Mamluks, took Jerusalem, the land of Israel, and kept it. And kept it way up into the 1500s when the Ottoman Empire took it over, destroyed the Mamluks, and then the Ottoman Empire established a caliphate, a global Muslim order. All right, but the issue with Christians, Jerusalem, Muslims, Jerusalem, really stems from the idea that Muhammad ascended from the Temple Mount on a horse into heaven, which isn't anywhere in their holy writings. It's sort of a legend that came along after. And the idea that Jesus was going to return at the end of the first millennia, so we must take Jerusalem on behalf of Christianity. So there is, I think, shared aggression on both sides for Jerusalem. Does that sort of answer your question? Maybe the answer is not what you wanted. Yes.
Well, it just seems it must be a better response, say to a Muslim, who I think is being brainwashed in his mosque, but about the Crusades. It's got to be a better response because they think we're so dumbed down that, oh yes, it's the Crusades that turned him violent.
I think trying to pin a Muslim in a debate setting about the Crusades is a futile effort. I don't think you'll be able to gain anything really, because the Christians were just as wrong about Jerusalem than the Muslims were. Who's been historically right about Jerusalem? The Jewish nation. Historically, the Jewish nation has been correct about the importance of Jerusalem.